This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good evening. We are coming on the air with breaking news set to rattle the 2024 presidential campaign and our country's legal landscape. Former President Donald Trump has just posted on social media that he has been told by the federal government that he is being indicted over what he calls the boxes hoax. That is special counsel Jack Smith's investigation into alleged mishandling of more than 100 classified documents discovered at his Mar-a-Lago home in Florida last year. It comes months after he became the first former president in U.S. history to be arrested for criminal charges. That was for a separate New York State case when he pleaded not guilty for his alleged role in hush money payments toward the end of his first campaign in 2016. We want to go right now to senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson. Hallie, what do we know and what's the impact?
Well, what we know is from Donald Trump himself, Lester, the former president, who in a post on his Truth Social platform says he has been notified that he has been indicted. He is issuing a fiery and familiar preemptive defense to this news, calling it, as you say, a so-called boxes hoax, and saying he's been summoned to court in Miami on Tuesday afternoon, presumably for an arraignment. Now, remember, this likely stems, and I want to be clear here, this is coming from Donald Trump himself. So far, NBC News has not independently verified this with anybody at the Justice Department or other sources at this point. This likely stems from that classified documents investigation that special counsel Jack Smith has been conducting for months now. Whether Donald Trump knowingly and intentionally broke the law by bringing classified material from the White House when he was president down to his Florida home. Remember, hundreds of documents were found when the FBI searched Mar-a-Lago last summer. It was August 8th, of course, that incredibly dramatic moment. And now it appears Donald Trump has been indicted, he says, because of those federal statutes, those laws about handling classified information properly. All along, Donald Trump, the former president, has maintained that as president, he could declassify anything at any time whenever he wanted to. That is a legal theory, a legal opinion that has not been tested. It clearly does not hold up in the view of the Justice Department. We have seen a number of witnesses and two grand juries now, one in D.C. and one in Florida, looking at this case. So significant news tonight, Lester. You talk about the legal landscape. There is obviously a political landscape as well. Donald Trump right now is the Republican frontrunner in the race for the White House. We have been here before as it related to an indictment against him. Different situation, different case, state level. That was in Manhattan. After that, we saw his poll numbers go up. We saw him tighten his grip on the Republican Party. We don't know what certainly will happen this time from here, but if past precedent is any indication, you may see the Republican base rally around him at this point, Lester. All
right, let's go into that legal lane. Hallie, thank you. Let's go to senior legal correspondent Laura Jarrett. Laura, what is the mechanism within the special counsel to officially announce any indictment?
It's a good question, Lester. We are trying very hard to confirm this news with the Justice Department to find out what precise charges the former president might be facing. He, of course, has posted in front of the whole world that he's been informed that he's been indicted, but he hasn't, at least that I've just seen, he hasn't actually specified the precise charges that he claims that he's facing. For some time, it's been our understanding that he's been under scrutiny, as Hallie laid out, for his retention of those documents improperly because he was no longer president and he was keeping them in a place that was not secure. We've also understood him to be facing scrutiny for obstruction of justice, having to do with obstructing the government's efforts to retrieve those documents. But we do not know at this point whether those are the precise charges he is facing. That was just our understanding based off of reporting from NBC and other outlets. But as I mentioned, we're going to keep pressing the Justice Department to find out exactly what's going on here. In terms of the normal mechanism in the normal case, typically a case like this would remain under seal until he has his first appearance, until he has his arraignment. He claims that it will be on Tuesday in Miami. Remember, the grand jury in Miami had at least one witness in there yesterday, and we had noticed a considerable amount of activity there at that courthouse today. We had noticed at least one member of the special counsel team there going back and forth, which we found curious, considering that the witness had left yesterday. And so we had been pressing to try to report out precisely why the special counsel had remained in Florida. Of course, there's also the grand jury that had been hearing this case in Washington, D.C. And so we need to understand, again, is he facing charges in Washington, in Florida, perhaps both? Is anyone else facing charges? Those are the questions that, of course, we are going to continue to press the Justice Department on, Lester.
Laura, is it an all-or-nothing proposition when it comes to the special counsel? He's been obviously looking into the documents issue, but also the January 6th issue. Could we see an indictment in one and then a decision delayed on another?
Yes, it's always been our understanding that the special counsel's work on January 6th, having to do with the former president's efforts to stay in office, to cling to power, all of that we've understood to be separate. We understand the timeline on that is ways off, as opposed to the documents case, which is much more ripe, which we had understood to be in its final stages, and the president now indicating it has reached a conclusion, Lester.
All right, Laura, I'll ask you to stand by. NBC's Garrett Haake has been covering the former president and joins near his estate in Bedminster, New Jersey. What can you tell us from there?
Lester, I can tell you that Donald Trump and his allies have been preparing for this moment for quite some time. They plan to use the same political playbook now that they used, in their view, quite successfully after his first indictment in New York City. The goal here, politically speaking, is to try to force Republicans to choose a side. You're either going to be with Donald Trump, the front runner for his party's nomination for president and its most recent president, or you're going to be with what they'll describe as liberal prosecutors who've been out to get him from the jump. Now, I can tell you that Trump's allies, his campaign team, had been calling around to allies on Capitol Hill. Other allies on Capitol Hill, House Republicans, had been preparing ever since he sent a post on his social media network a few days ago saying that this should be a congressional priority for this moment. They've essentially been told to stand by and prepare to defend the president publicly. So what you're going to see here in the coming days is, again, a similar effort to what the Trump campaign did right after New York. They're going to aggressively raise money. They're already sending out fundraising emails with Mr. Trump's Truth Social posts to their network. They will try to aggressively raise money here, and then they will look to see how the other Republican candidates respond. Already today, we saw Mr. Trump's PAC calling out Chris Christie and Asa Hutchinson, two low-polling Republican contenders who had condemned his actions in and around this particular case. They're going to try to force the hands of other candidates, especially Ron DeSantis of Florida, who they see as their primary rival, try to force him to either defend Donald Trump or be on the side of the Biden Justice Department and liberal prosecutors. That's how the former president is going to try to frame it politically, because he and his team believe it will work. They saw it work after New York, Lester.
All right, Garrett, thanks very much. Let me go back to Hallie Jackson. Hallie, you've learned more about when this could all end up in court.
Yeah, it is looking like Tuesday afternoon, based on what Donald Trump himself is saying in Miami in district court there. He is saying about 3 in the afternoon, so Tuesday afternoon. And this is sure to be, Lester, frankly, a spectacle, because it is the specter of a former president. Again, if this holds and if these are the charges we think that they are, as Donald Trump is indicating here, that he has been indicted, a former president and Republican frontrunner for the White House again, now apparently indicted, he says, on federal charges. That is a significant moment in both the legal and the political landscape. We've seen this before, right? We saw the helicopters over New York City as Donald Trump was making his way to court back in that case several months ago. TBD on what we'll see in Miami. But remember, this is South Florida. This is not far from Donald Trump's relatively Mar-a-Lago home in Palm Beach. There is going to be the visual here of Donald Trump showing up in court as you're taking a look now at Mar-a-Lago. And I think one thing we can be certain of, he will try to turn this to his political advantage despite the legal liability here. The former president is already fundraising off of this. We've seen that even just tonight in the last couple of minutes here. And that is a moment, obviously, Lester, that a lot of people are circling on their calendars. There's still a lot, and we want to be clear about this, a lot that we're working to find out. Our teams are reporting this out as we speak as it relates to the specific charges, the counts, et cetera, and where this goes next, Lester. But we do know that in the next couple of days, another pivotal moment here. I'll tell you what else we're watching. The way that Donald Trump's current competitors in the Republican primary may react to this. We know that in the past, some of them had echoed his claims of partisanship by the Justice Department here as it related to the legal issues he's facing. We will see as we start to get into the evening hours as this news starts to get out, how they'll respond this time around, Lester.
All right. We'll ask you to stand by again. Hallie, NBC News Chief White House correspondent Kristen Welker joins me. Let's pick up on this issue of the political fallout. Certainly, we've seen the number of potential Republican candidates multiply this week. They all had to know this moment might come and how they want to play it. What's your intel on that?
Well, Lester, based on my conversations with numerous officials inside these campaigns, I am told that they are trying to determine how and when to sharpen their attacks against former President Trump. As Hallie just noted, we haven't seen that yet. They really stood behind him during that initial indictment. Will we see that this time around? I think that remains to be seen. I think the debates are going to be a key potential turning point. I stress that word potential because there's some real risk in sharply criticizing Mr. Trump, right? Because no one wants to alienate his base. And so that is why you're seeing so many candidates, Ron DeSantis, Mike Pence, really take a very cautious approach when talking about the former president. I'll tell you who's not, and that is the current commander-in-chief, President Biden. Today, my colleague Peter Alexander asked him about some of the pressure that former President Trump has been putting on the Justice Department. President Biden emphasizing that he has never pressured the Justice Department, so really trying to draw that distinction already, Lester.
All right. Thank you, Kristen. Let me bring in former federal prosecutor and NBC News legal analyst Carol Lamb. I'd like to talk about the significance of this happening in Florida. We had all been watching a grand jury in Washington, and then suddenly in the last 2 days, Florida popped up on the map. Where do you think this is going?
Yeah, so everyone did think that this was a grand jury that was being run out of Washington, D.C. What we didn't know was whether they were looking at the January 6th events or whether they were looking at the documents case or both. I think the assumption was they were looking at both. When it came to light that a Florida grand jury had been impaneled, it became clear, I think, to most of us that that it was pretty likely that that the special counsel had concluded that venue, what we call venue, where the charges should be brought, probably had to be in Florida because that's where the locus, where the primary events took place with respect to the retention of the documents and the obstruction of justice. I think Jack Smith probably researched that a lot and concluded that the safer course was to bring these charges in Florida. So it's going to be a Florida grand jury, a Florida jury, Florida judges, Florida appellate court, all the way up to the Supreme Court.
All right, Carol, thank you. I'll ask you to stand by. Let me bring Laura back into this. Laura, the former president, and we've confirmed, as you see on the screen, two sources confirming Mr. Trump will be indicted in the documents probe. But the documents probe is a pretty wide term. Yeah. How many and what are the relative seriousness of the charges at the prosecutor's disposal?
Well, the most serious would be obviously showing classified documents to someone who's not authorized to receive them, or even obstructing justice. I mean, that's talking about 20 years there. Of course, we do need to see the precise charges in order to evaluate exactly what he's facing, Lester. And all along, he's maintained that he's done nothing wrong. His defenses have ranged from I can declassify anything I want to I can declassify anything in my mind. But at least on some of the espionage charges, which is what we think might be at play here based on some of our reporting, the prosecutors don't actually have to prove that anything was classified. All they have to prove is that it was national defense information, something that would be useful to U.S. adversaries, and that it was a close hold, and that he didn't have the authorization to receive them. Certainly, he didn't have the authorization to receive them if he was no longer president and he was receiving them at Florida in Mar-a-Lago in an insecure setting. And so it's worth noting here that even though his main defense has been, I can do anything I want, I can declassify anything I want, that might be gutted. And it might also be gutted by the very fact that we have reporting that he said on tape that he knew he couldn't actually show classified information to people, that he was on tape talking about that a document that he had kept after he left the White House, Lester.
So what are some likely avenues of defense with the little information we have here? What are some likely avenues?
His best avenue of defense is to say simply, this was a big mistake. My staff simply swept all the documents into a box and shipped them down to Florida because there wasn't a great process for dealing with things. Everything was sort of in a scurry after, I lost the election. And so it really wasn't in my hands. That his best defense would really be one of complete ignorance. But of course, the fact that he retained the documents even after he was repeatedly asked to give them back, both by the National Archives and by the Justice Department after they found out that he had them, really is undercutting his best defense there. That really works against him. If he had simply returned the documents and said, I'm sorry, it was all a big mistake, I think we'd be in a very different position than one where we found ourselves, I think now, where he was repeatedly asked to give them back, and the Justice Department had to go as far as to get a search warrant for his home in Florida.
All right, let me go back. Kristen Welker again, our White House correspondent. Kristen, we're hearing from the White House. Obviously, they're walking a very narrow line.
Very narrow line. They're not commenting tonight, Lester, but I can tell you that earlier in this week, a source familiar with the planning at the White House saying that you can expect they will not be engaging in this directly. It is going to be business as usual. Of course, President Biden has announced his reelection campaign. We've already seen that strategy start to play out, trying to really emphasize that he is the person in the Oval Office right now carrying out the duties of the presidency. Look, they are prepared for former President Trump to blame President Biden if that happens. We are told they will emphasize the rule of law. What I just said a few minutes ago, the fact that President Biden has really tried to emphasize the DOJ is a separate branch from the White House. And so I think you're going to see, again, this attempt to try to draw those sorts of distinctions. And just going back to politically speaking, the potential impact on the former president, Lester, I would just remind our viewers, look, he continues to be the strong Republican frontrunner. His person who's closest to him, Ron DeSantis, is double digits behind. So the question is, at what point will his Republican rivals start to engage? We continue to watch that very closely. Continue to reach out to the White House for any reaction. So far, no specific reaction tonight, Lester.
Yeah, the implications, though, are huge and will generate a lot of conversation. Let's go back to Hallie Jackson now. Hallie, walk us through how we got to where we are right now.
Well, but stretches back to May of 2021, Lester. That is when the National Archives realized that some of the classified documents that they would have expected to have from the Trump White House didn't exist. Remember, the National Archives is a place where presidents hand over whatever documents of sensitive materials they have that are classified to be entered into kind of the official government record once they leave the presidency. So the National Archives said basically, hey, we don't have everything that we think that we need here. That led to months of back and forth. And then in January of 2022, so over a year ago, we saw the president's team turn over something like 15 boxes of classified records. It was in February that the FBI opened, we believe, that criminal investigation. Now, in early June, you had some FBI agents and others go down to South Florida. They got more material and a letter from Donald Trump's attorney saying essentially that was it. That was everything they had. That turned out, as we know, not to be true because of what you're seeing here in August. Another batch of documents taken by the FBI as the search warrant was executed at Mar-a-Lago. You'll remember that sort of now infamous picture of those documents laid out. Donald Trump at the time pushed back very strongly on that. He didn't like to see, this is the picture, he didn't like to see that picture out there. Now, it was later in August that a judge unsealed that search warrant that laid out what Laura has been talking about here, what we've been discussing on this special report, which potential federal crimes Donald Trump may have violated, including, for example, the Espionage Act. Some of those clues, some of those details came from that search warrant. The Trump team tried to push back, right? They wanted a special master appointed here. There was some legal back and forth. You probably remember some of the coverage of that. But as that played out, that is when Jack Smith was named by Attorney General Merrick Garland to oversee both of these sort of buckets here in this broader investigation. The classified documents piece, that's what we're talking about now, as well as, by the way, sort of separately, parallel, under the same umbrella, any wrongdoing, anything illegal that Donald Trump may have done related to the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Again, different sort of set of circumstances here. I think what we're talking about are these, of course, classified documents and that investigation, that probe. We have seen Donald Trump, as he's been running for the White House, furious about this. He has pushed back on this. We've talked about it quite a bit here. And at this point, the defiance from Donald Trump is set, right? We know that that's happening. The question is, what do the people around him do? And I'm talking about the people who are up against him in the Republican primary. We have seen some of them make a case for their own campaign. And I'm talking about somebody like former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, who has just announced this week that he is running, push back against this, Lester.
Hallie Jackson, thank you. That concludes this NBC News special report. We'll have much more on our streaming channel, NBC News Now. Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.